Ryū Ga Gotoku Kenzan.
RGG Kenzan, or for this video just Kenzan, was the very first PS3 game for the Yakuza series. Now the RGG bit is the name of the franchise in Japan, which I didn't really delve into in the previous two videos, but for the sake of this video I'll still just call it the Yakuza franchise. The game came out in Japan exclusively in 2008, being after Yakuza 2 and before Yakuza 3. And when I say Japan exclusive, that doesn't always mean just Japan, because sometimes it might come out in places like South Korea or whatever. So basically Japan exclusive means we didn't get it in the Western world. After release, the game saw nothing else. That was it. The game came out and then nothing else ever happened. Unlike the previous two games, Kenzan never saw a remake or even a remaster, and still to this day shows no sign of that ever happening. It's also funny to think that this game came out in the same year that Yakuza 2 was released worldwide, and also that the Wikipedia page for the game references a statement made by someone from SEGA of Australia, which is a big fat lol because they've been dead for ages. The game also being a very early PS3 game, and again being their first PS3 game, meant that it didn't utilize the hardware anywhere near as optimally as something like Yakuza Kiwami, which was their last title released for the PS3. So because of that, you would probably find that the game wouldn't fit the developer's current quality standards. Not because the game is bad, but instead because they would probably see so much that they'd want to improve, meaning that a remaster like Yakuza 1 and 2 HD would be out of the question. Instead, the game would more likely see a full-fledged remake like Kiwami 1 and 2, but again, the likelihood of that ever happening probably isn't all too high unless they find that there's a gap in their development or something and we randomly see it get announced in like 2025. Now, in terms of story of this game, it takes place, as you could probably guess, in a time that's a lot older than the contemporary setting of the first two games. It's in the early 1600s, and while they aren't exactly the same characters, the game uses the faces and voices of characters like Kiryu and Haruka to portray the characters in this game. Kiryu acts as Miyamoto Musashi, a real guy who really existed, and Haruka plays Haruka, a fake girl who was made up. And then there's Majima or something. There's also Karawa from Yakuza 2, whose face is now modelled after his actor, which yes, this was the first game to do it being of course that the various characters' faces were modelled after their actors. Kiryu, for example, has now received a facelift from his PS2 design, as his face had been redesigned to look more like his actor, Takuya Kuroda. This face then became his face for all future games to come. The trend was also set up by this game to start modelling more and more characters' faces after their actors, which, as good as that is to add more realistic detail and to have faces that match voices much closer, there have been a few problems with that throughout some of the games, which I'll explain in future videos. Anyway, with that little side note out of the way, it's time to explain to you the story. I'll be honest though and say that I've very little experience with this game because I've still never gotten around to finishing it, but I have done lots of research on the game. So basically, Miyamoto Musashi is a guy that I only know about because of this game, and then because he has a quote that can show up when you die in Modern Warfare 2 Reboot. Anyway, then some shit happens with human sex trafficking, and then Kiryu and Haruka get married or some fucking bullshit. I don't know the story of this game because no one ever talks about it, and when someone does talk about it, you get people all over the place saying, no, that's not what happens, and then you ask them what does happen, and then they don't give you an answer. Anyway, the story happens, who cares? The game itself is actually the important thing, and considering both the setting of the game and the fact that it was again their first PS3 title, the developers had to create a lot of new assets and other codey things, and thanks to their efforts, the team were able to use a lot of what was created in Kenzan, as well as their next game Yakuza 3, in a lot of future titles. You could look at Kenzan and Yakuza 3 as the first revolution for the series, of which so far there's been basically 3. But an example of some of the fresh stuff is that the camera when outside of combat is no longer stuck in fixed angles like the PS2 games. The camera in combat is also controllable, unlike the PS2 games, but unlike the other PS3 games, the way it focuses on things and move around is a bit different. It's not that it's bad, but it isn't as good as later games. It is understandable though that they didn't know exactly how to get the camera right, because to be fair to them, it wasn't like there was a game that came out a couple of years prior that did a way better job. The game also features a fair few different areas to explore, rather than just the one Kamurocho. If you want me to list those areas, then your inventory space in Kenzan was much bigger than it was in the PS2 games, as Miyamoto Musashi obviously has boys' pockets, whereas PS2 Kiryu obviously has girls' pockets. This was also the first game to have revelations, a pretty popular feature from the series where your character sees some crazy shit and then becomes so inspired by what they saw that they end up developing abilities off of it. Speaking of abilities, considering that the Yakuza games basically always have been RPGs, this game takes it a bit further by making it that you have a traditional level up system, like in actual RPGs, with your stats going up as you gain more levels. In the first two games, you would gain essentially skill points whenever an experience bar would hit the maximum level, but things like your HP and heat gauge would only go up when you spend the skill points to unlock abilities that would then also have the stat buffs tied to them, such as increased health. Yakuza 3 was the only other game that worked the exact same way as the first two games, but a few of the other games ended up having similar systems to Kenzan. Although in Kenzan, level leveling up wouldn't grant you abilities, and instead you had to learn all of them through various other means. The game was also the first to feature fighting styles, although unlike the future games, it was basically an unarmed style and then 4 variations of the slugger style from zero. It wasn't as much a fighting style as it was just having 4 different weapon types that you could equip. They each had their own combos and abilities, but considering how earning XP and skills works in Kenzan, you don't invest into any skill trees or anything like that like you do with the later games. You may notice as well that the animations of things like the sword and dagger weapons ended up getting reused in later games, with the combo attacks from Kenzan being in Yakuza 3 and a few other games. In a historical sense, these styles don't stick out as much as things like the styles in Zero and Lost Judgment, but at the time it definitely added a lot more to the game than the one style that Kiri has in Yakuza 1 and 2. You also can get up to 13 bars of heat, which I believe is tied for the most amount of heat bars you can get in a game, where it's tied with Tanimura and Yakuza 4, but I could be wrong, I don't know. Now then, while my experience playing the game is quite limited, I do have a bit of experience listening to the soundtrack, and I dare say that it's quite a good one. It blends the traditional Yakuza sound with some music that feels very appropriate for the settings. Songs like Ballet Con Mariposa or something, I don't bloody know, is a goddamn good one. But then For Will is a song that you'd expect from a samurai game like this. It also featured the talents of Keisuke Ito, who's based as hell because he's one of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon guys. Hell yeah. I would definitely recommend giving some of the songs a listen, because in comparison to the other soundtracks, it has some very low play counts on Spotify, and it absolutely deserves more. Now then, when it comes to getting your hands on this game, it is definitely a lot more of a hassle than the PS2 games. There doesn't exist an English version in any capacity. There does exist some guides for the game that are in English, as well as cutscenes and whatnot on YouTube being translated into English, but there is no way to play the game in English to any official capacity. Maybe there exists an English translation patch made by fans, but I've never heard of one. I'm not sure as well if the game is available on the online PS3 store in Japan. It's hard to verify that too, considering that Sony are very quietly brushing the PS3 and PS Vita under the rug like they've already done with the PSP, and like Nintendo did with the Wii U and 3DS. So then you might think to emulate it, and Sega, if you're listening, stop listening. But this game is a bitch to emulate. Like with a lot of PS3 games, emulating them is quite hard for various reasons. With Kenzan, the entire game is very weirdly red, besides a few indoor areas where it's fine. However, your boy Snowiest, however you say my name, has some tips for you. Or at least I do for specifically RPCS3. I don't know if there are other PS3 emulators, but anyway, be sure that in your GPU settings you set the renderer to OpenGL and tick strict rendering mode. But the most important thing to take away from this is, shut up Sega, you heard nothing, go away. Considering as well that in terms of gameplay, this game is much closer to Yakuza 3 than it is to Yakuza 2, it means that it's a lot more like the modern games. So if you enjoy the gameplay of Yakuza 3 or 4, then you'll probably enjoy Kenzan. I'm sure I would too, but I've just never really gotten around to doing it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then make sure you do what this cool Indian bullfrog says and like the video. That's an Urban Rescue Ranch reference. Also, subscribe and get ready for the next video that rocks around this series, being Yakuza 3, the black sheep of the Yakuza franchise.